What is economics? Good day, my name is Chick Kelly. The purpose of this intellectual engagement is to build the economics perspective. There is an inescapable reality about human existence. The needs and wants of Homo sapiens, all 8 billion of us on Earth, are infinite, insatiable. The economic resources necessary to produce those goods and services are scarce or limited. It is this burden of scarcity which forces us to deal with the inescapable reality. Human beings can't have everything we need and want. That reality is, in essence, the field of economics. Check out the left side of this inequality. Economic resources. Land resources are the gifts of nature: copper, mineral, timbers, rare earth elements, oil, natural gas, water, etc. Those land resources are scarce. Capital. Manufactured aids and tools used in the productive process, whether tangible machines and equipment or intangible logistic systems and software, scarce. Labor. The physical and mental capabilities of human beings used in the productive process. Here in the United States, there's roughly 170 million Americans in the U.S. labor force. Across planet Earth, labor is a scarce resource. Human needs and wants. Think about the needs and wants of everyone on the planet. Wouldn't it be great if everyone could have access to health care and medicine? It would be tremendous if we could provide air conditioning and heating to everyone all the time. It would just be some utopia if every road on Earth was perfectly paved. It would be wonderful if every river, stream, and ocean was perfectly pristine, remove all pollutants. The reality is, the burden of scarcity forces us to make choices. Therefore, economics is the field of study which applies to every aspect of human reality. And the best approach to continuing our study of the economics perspective is to formalize the definition of economics. Economics is the social science concerned with the most efficient use of limited or scarce resources to maximize satisfaction of human wants. Two words here vitally important to our definition or understanding of economics: social science. Studying human beings in the everyday business of life. This is not chemistry. We don't have the luxury of operating in a laboratory. Planet Earth is our laboratory for economists. Every society is broken into three components. The private sector is made up of households/individuals, basically us people living our lives, and businesses. The public sector is made up of government. Vitally important to identify the three components of every society, because the concepts and principles developed in the economics perspective apply equally to all three components of a country or nation. Building the economics perspective requires a reiteration of the most important principle of this field of study. The burden of scarcity is an unavoidable human reality. Economic resources of land, capital, and labor are scarce or limited relative to human needs and wants. Scarcity forces us people on Earth to make choices, and every single solitary time we make a choice, there is a cost involved. Economists have a famous saying for this concept: there is no such thing as a free lunch. The essence of this idea is captured by the term opportunity cost. The value of any choice is measured by what is given up, the next best alternative. An example is relevant. If a land resource is used in one economic capacity, let's just say to construct housing, it is no longer available for any alternative use. Therefore, the value of all choices is measured by the next best alternative of how these resources could have been allocated otherwise. If the burden of scarcity is unavoidable and limited resources force human beings to make choices, and every choice involves a cost, it makes sense that human beings should act rationally. In his book, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith addressed the concept of rational behavior. His explanation: human beings act in their own self-interest to maximize utility. Now, there is a misperception that rational self-interest is the same as selfishness. This is not true. Parents dedicate their time from dawn to dusk taking care of their children for decades. Americans lead the world in total number of volunteer hours and per capita volunteer hours. There are lots of selfless human beings. They're still acting in their own self-interest. Utility is a fancy way of saying the satisfaction, gratification that a human being gets from participating in an activity or consuming a good or service. Another idea about rational behavior. Rational behavior does not mean everyone in the same situation will make the same decisions. For instance, 3 young people graduate from high school. One person decides to enter college full-time, one person decides to enter the workforce, and one person decides to join the military. Everyone is acting in their own rational self-interest. Remember, economic concepts apply to all 3 components of society: individuals/households, businesses, and government. Businesses act in their own rational self-interest to maximize not utility but profit, and governments are allegedly supposed to act in the collective interest of all the citizens within their nation to maximize everyone's happiness. The burden of scarcity is an economic reality. Scarcity forces us to make choices. Every choice involves a cost. Therefore, people should act rationally. Individuals act in their own rational self-interest to maximize utility. Businesses act to maximize profits. And allegedly, supposedly, hopefully, governments act rationally to maximize the collective utility of the citizens in their respective nations. Many decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Marginal analysis is a key component of the economics perspective. The economist measures the value of any decision, the next unit of consumption or activity, by identifying the marginal benefits and weighing the additional utility or benefits relative to the marginal costs. The next unit of consumption or the next unit of activity makes sense as long as the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal costs. Some examples to solidify this extremely important idea of marginal analysis, as it is a key component of all economic thinking. An individual is currently dedicating 6 hours per week to working out, to exercise. Does it make sense to add an additional 2 hours to their weekly exercise regimen? The marginal benefits of 2 more hours of exercise, the physical and mental improvement associated with more working out. The marginal cost: what else could that person have done with their time? If they're a student, they could have dedicated 2 more hours to their academic responsibilities. If they're a parent, they could have spent the 2 hours hanging out with their children, so additional child rearing. As long as the marginal benefits of the additional 2 hours of working out is greater than the marginal cost, that decision makes sense. If marginal costs are greater than marginal benefits, at the margin, that decision should not be undertaken. What about a business? Typically, it's easier to quantify marginal benefits and marginal cost when using marginal analysis to evaluate business decisions. For instance, ABC Company currently has 13 employees. ABC Company is deliberating. doesn't make economic sense to add a 14th unit of labor. The marginal cost, salary and fringe benefits of the next worker. The marginal benefits, how much does that next worker increase total production for the company, and what are the potential sales revenue associated with that increased output or production. As long as the potential revenue associated with hiring that next worker is greater than the cost, it makes sense to bring that person on board. Businesses use marginal thinking all the time. ABC Company is currently operating 3 stores/locations. Does it make economic sense at the margin to open up a 4th location? As long as the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal cost, that decision makes economic sense. Governments are forced to think at the margin all the time. Local, state, federal governments all face budgetary constraints. Local, state, federal governments are required to make decisions regarding the social services they offer and the use of tax revenues. Example, the city of Philadelphia is deliberating at the margin. Does it make sense to allocate more of the scarce resources in the city budget to parks, to beautification of parks? Obviously, the additional utility, citizens of that great city will enjoy the ambiance and human experience of a better park system. The marginal cost, how could those resources been allocated otherwise, perhaps improving roads or schools? If the marginal benefit of the next unit is greater than the marginal cost, that decision makes sense. Obviously, there's a normative debate about many marginal decisions. For instance, at the federal level, the great marginal debate of our time, how much of the government budget should be allocated to immigration enforcement. And it is often difficult to weigh marginal benefits versus marginal cost. One last important idea about marginal thinking. There can be too much of a good thing. In the city of Philadelphia, there is a river, a body of water that runs right through the center of town, pretty much, the Schuylkill River. The Schuylkill River is not the most pristine body of water. It could be made cleaner. Scientifically, it is possible to make the Schuylkill River cleaner. I don't think anybody would eat any of the fish that they caught from the river. I don't see people swimming in the river. It could definitely be cleaner. But using marginal analysis, the economist would argue the river is as clean as it needs to be, because the marginal cost of making the river more pristine is greater than the marginal benefits of how the resources could have been allocated otherwise. In other words, the city has more pressing issues. Perhaps it is best to sustain or increase police presence or fire and emergency services, or allocate more resources to education. Therefore, even though no one would argue that making the Schuylkill River is cleaner, the act of doing so, the marginal cost would be greater than the marginal benefits. Incentives matter. People act according to the rules of engagement. Altering the rules of engagement will likewise change people's behavior. I often watch CNBC and or Bloomberg television. The commentators and pundits on those business news shows, when discussing socioeconomic issues, quote this key idea, this key concept of the economics perspective, incentives matter, almost daily. Some examples serve to clarify these important economic principles. From the individual perspective, assume you entered a class on the first day of semester, first class. The professor hands out the syllabus. The syllabus outlines how final grades will be determined. The syllabus states 20% of the final grade is the quiz average, and there will be 10 quizzes for the semester. The day before the first quiz, the professor announces any student who earns 100% on quiz 1 will receive a 100% quiz average for the entire semester, basically alleviating the need to study for the remaining 9 quizzes. Obviously, based on incentives, the students will study like gangbusters for that first quiz. Years ago, before my time, my dad often talks about this, the IRS allowed individuals to write off interest, not only against mortgage interest, but interest on credit card debt, interest on car loans, and interest on any other type of loan, say for a boat, against earned income. When those interest deductions were eliminated, the sales of luxury automobiles declined, the sales of boats declined, and people didn't carry as much interest expense on their credit cards. From the business perspective, in 2007 there was a housing crisis which led to the financial crisis of 2008 and the Great Recession of 2008/2009. It is considered the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. When Barack Obama took office, the economy was reeling. In an effort to kickstart economic activity, the administration instituted fiscal stimulus. Part of the fiscal policy response to the Great Recession was accelerated depreciation expense. In other words, businesses could write off the depreciation on capital, on machines and equipment at a faster rate. The idea behind this was it incentivized businesses to take that excess cash and purchase new machines or refurbish existing equipment, thereby kickstarting economic activity. Another business example. In 2024, Donald Trump was elected for a second term, becoming only the second individual in presidential history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, Grover Cleveland being the other. Trump threatened mega increases on tariffs on many of the trading partners of the United States. In response to the proposed tariffs, at the beginning of the year, businesses rushed out to purchase lots of goods before the tariffs were implemented. In the first quarter of 2025, imports skyrocketed because businesses were acting on incentives. The government is incentivizing human beings in the United States to purchase EVs. How does this work? Any individual who buys an electric vehicle receives a $7,500 subsidy to purchase the alternative to a combustion engine car. Obviously, the government believes that EVs are environmentally friendly, or I should say more environmentally friendly than combustion engine vehicles. Whether that's the case or not is up for debate, but to incentivize Americans to purchase more EVs, the government offering $7,500 in a subsidy to anyone who purchases an electric vehicle. The Irish government has been struggling with the issue of extremely high housing costs, especially rental expenses. To address this housing shortage, the Irish government has recently relaxed rent controls, all but eliminating the price ceiling that was in place on landlords. The idea, without the price ceiling, if landlords are permitted to charge whatever rent they wish, they are incentivized to find new opportunities to purchase property, build additional housing units, which will increase the supply of rental units and thereby lower prices. When the rules of engagement are changed, people's behaviors change, human beings act on incentives. A concept closely related to incentives matter is the principle economic events create secondary effects. Economic events do not occur in a vacuum. Economic events have repercussions. Let's revisit the examples from the incentives matter to discussion to demonstrate how and why economic events create secondary effects. First, the professor with the policy, any student who earns a 100% on quiz 1 receives a 100% quiz average for the term. Assume there are 30 students in the class. Obviously, the instructor has no intention of giving 100% quiz average to all 30 students. Assume there are 20 questions on the first quiz. The teacher constructs the first academic offering such that of the 20 questions, 18 are straightforward and 2 are nearly impossible, making it extremely challenging to earn that 100%. However, the secondary effects are straightforward. Students understand that by putting in the academic effort by studying, a good grade is achievable on all quizzes. What about the interest deduction expense and the removal of that tax benefit for individuals filing income tax? Faced with the fact that they are no longer allowed to write off the expense against a car note, a boat loan, or credit card interest debt, individuals cut back on purchasing luxury automobiles, they bought fewer boats, and they carried less credit card debt. All three of those industries suffered. The economic secondary effects were straightforward. Fewer luxury automobiles were bought, fewer boats were bought, and credit card companies collected less interest expense revenues. Astute investors could have realized the secondary effects of such policy and shorted the stocks of those companies. How about the business examples and the secondary effects of the accelerated depreciation and the tariff import example? First, the idea of accelerated depreciation. Barack Obama took office during one of the worst economic downturns in U.S. economic history. The fiscal stimulus passed by his administration included accelerated depreciation, allowing businesses to write off the expense on capital, on machines and equipment, at a much quicker rate. This freed up cash for businesses to spend on new projects. The secondary effects: spending money on new projects lower the unemployment rate. When businesses invest in new machinery or refurbishing old equipment on new projects, they need employees to run those machines, and this kickstarted economic activity. How about the Trump administration tariff policy? To avoid paying the high tariff, in the beginning of 2025, businesses rushed out to import goods they knew would be much more costly a few months down the road. What were the secondary effects of such policy? The trade deficit, which is U.S. imports relative to U.S. exports, skyrocketed in the first quarter of 2025. How about the government examples? The first example was the federal government offers a $7,500 $7,500 subsidy for any individual who purchases an EV, electric vehicle. The Trump administration is discussing removing that subsidy. The subsidy obviously kickstarted the EV industry. It was great for companies like Tesla. People found the Tesla car less expensive because there was really a $7,500 coupon when purchasing a new electric vehicle. If the Trump administration is successful in eliminating that subsidy, sales of EVs will decline. And the final example, the Irish government relaxing rent controls. It sounds counterintuitive, but by allowing landlords to charge the market price for rental units and relaxing the government policy, in the long run, housing prices will decline. Why is that the case? Landlords, entrepreneurs will be incentivized to find new properties to renovate and offer as housing, or to purchase land and build housing, increasing the supply of rental units and thereby bringing down the price of rent for Irish rental customers. Economic events create secondary effects. A key component of the economics perspective is opportunity cost. The value of any decision is measured by the next best alternative. What must one forego or give up whenever they make a decision? To consume a good or service or pursue some activity, the next best alternative is the measure of the value of that choice. Economists use the phrase, "there is no such thing as a free lunch," to capture the essence of this important economic idea. Free to me, but not free to society. The economist points out, every decision, all choices involves a cost. There is always a cost. Assume the local restaurant allows me and my 25 students to visit for lunch and doesn't charge us for the meal. The economist points out, whoa, the resources that were necessary to provide the meal to the 26 of us are no longer available for alternative use. The wait staff, the host, the chef, the food itself, utilities to keep the heat or air conditioning running and the lights on, how did the food get delivered to the restaurant, those transportation resources and the energy, gasoline and oil. You get the idea. Opportunity cost is applicable to individuals, businesses, and government. Assume two students graduate from high school. One decides to go to full-time university. The other decides to go to work for FedEx. The full-time student can't simultaneously work. The opportunity cost of attending college is above and beyond just the tuition, room, and board. It's the next best alternative, the foregone salary. A business is evaluating two candidates, Mary and Michael. If the business decides to hire Mary, the opportunity cost is the lost skill set of Michael, what he could have offered to the organization. A government is deciding whether to increase military spending or to allocate more resources for educational services. If money is spent on military output, guns and tanks and bombs and planes and ships, it's no longer available to expand educational services for, say, urban settings. The opportunity cost of any decision is measured by the next best alternative. To challenge students to demonstrate a thorough understanding of opportunity cost, I offer this example. Assume there's a class of 40 students. You have arrived on campus and you recognize that you forgot to bring your backpack. You need a backpack to transport your supplies and books to and from class. The backpack you want to purchase is available for sale on the campus store or at the campus store for $70. The same backpack is available down the road at a local vendor at a local store off campus for $60. You can save $10. But to visit the off-campus store, you need to jump on the university shuttle. It's going to take you 40 minutes to ride to the off-campus site, purchase the backpack at a $10 discount relative to the campus store, and return to your dormitory. When I ask students, is it worth their time, effort, energy, the 40 minutes, to save $10 on the backpack, in a class of 40, 3 or 5 hands will raise. The other students don't believe it's worth their time, effort, energy, 40 minutes to save $10. Then I change the scenario and say, what if instead of saving $10, you would save $20? So the backpack is available at the off-campus site for $50 relative to the $70 on campus. Then more hands go up in the air. Finally, I ask students, what if there was a $30 differentiation? So for 40 minutes on the shuttle, taking the university transportation to the off-campus site and returning, you can save not 10, not 20, but $30. At that point, most students believe it's worth their time, effort, and energy. It's worth the opportunity cost of the 40-minute ride back and forth to save $30. Then I start this scenario over with a different product. Assume now that you arrived on campus with the intention of purchasing a laptop as a technological aid for your academic efforts. The laptop you desire to buy is for sale at the campus store for $1,000 even. But you could travel to that same off-campus site and save $10. When I ask students if it's worth the 40 minutes to save $10 on the laptop, an interesting result. The same students who said that they would take the 40-minute shuttle ride to save $10 no longer believe it's worth their time to save $10 on the laptop. However, the economist points out that the starting price of the product should not enter into your mindset and is completely irrelevant. The opportunity cost of both products is the same. It doesn't matter what the starting price is. The opportunity cost is the 40 minutes spent on the shuttle to and from the off-campus site to acquire the product at a lower price. When pointed out, students are sometimes taken back, but finally realize, how do you measure the value of a decision, the next best alternative? Economists sound rather braggadocious when they claim their field of study applies to all domestic and global issues. However, this claim is not so far-fetched. In many ways, economics is the study of everything. Let's evaluate this list and demonstrate how and why economic thinking is applicable to all socioeconomic issues domestically and internationally. Healthcare. How does a nation decide how to allocate the resources necessary to provide healthcare services for its citizens? There are two options. The government can control the resources, and you could nationalize healthcare. Or it could be privatized, and the market could determine what services are offered and the price of those services. The United States has a unique system because it's a combination of those two approaches. If the government were to take control of the healthcare system, it could institute a salary cap for surgeons. Incentives matter. Disincentivizing intelligent women and men from becoming surgeons may reduce the effectiveness of those necessary healthcare workers. We want the most talented women and men to become heart surgeons and orthopedic surgeons and brain surgeons. Putting a salary cap on the money they earn might make them decide it's not worth undergoing 7 years of schooling plus residency to become a surgeon. The other interesting aspect of these socioeconomic issues is that they're not mutually exclusive. We'll revisit healthcare when we talk about Social Security in a few moments. Education. Economists recognize that economic growth can be achieved by increasing the amount of resources or increasing the quality of existing resources. A better educated workforce generates faster economic growth. The economists might challenge the institution of union and tenureship for public schools. Do we have the most talented individuals educating grade school and high school students? Would it be worth the time, effort, and energy to overturn this institution? Well, that would become with much political debate, and it wouldn't be something that was readily received by certain members of society. Plus, we couldn't guarantee that changing that institution would actually improve the educational system. But it is something to think about in economic terms. Social Security. The Roosevelt administration instituted this social welfare benefit in the 30s during the Great Depression. The Roosevelt administration chose the age of 65 for people to start receiving this benefit because at the time the expected lifespan of the average American was approximately 67. It was designed to provide financial assistance to individuals who had retired for approximately 2 or 3 years, not 2 or 3 decades. There's many problems with Social Security. First, there's a lot fewer people paying into the system relative to those individuals receiving the benefit today than when this social service began in the 1930s. Likewise, in addition to the monthly benefit that retired people receive, Medicare is part of the Social Security system, healthcare for elderly individuals. One of the debates that we must face: how much healthcare services should we provide people over the last couple years of their life? Britain puts a cap on the amount of money spent on people at the end of their livelihood. This is also a moral decision, but it demonstrates how and why economics applies to almost everything. Defense, homeland security, war. Currently, the United States spends roughly $900 billion on defense spending. That works out to be 15% of the federal budget. There are many geopolitical instability issues that the world is currently dealing with. Russia invaded Ukraine over 3 years ago. Israel is at war with Hamas and recently invaded Iran in an attempt to reduce their ability to make nuclear weapons. China is threatening to invade and take over Taiwan. Does the United States want to cut military spending at a time of geopolitical instability? I don't have the answer, but it demonstrates at the margin why economics applies to this important issue. AOC, or Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, in 2019, over 6 years ago, predicted that without change, the world would end in 12 years because of climate change. Well, we're more than halfway to her doomsday prediction, and I would bet all the money I have in the world that the world's not going to end in 6 years. But it still makes sense for capitalist systems to address the pollution generated from economic activity. It still makes sense to acknowledge the environmental damage done by free market capitalism. And at the margin, there needs to be intelligent regulation to address the environmental issues of economic activity. International trade. The United States has been running large trade deficits for the last 20 years, pushing nearly $1 trillion per year. Imports exceed exports by a large dollar number. The international trade issue is interesting because most of our trade deficit is with one country. You can guess it, yes, China, although we have a rather large trade deficit with Mexico as well. And China is not exactly a strategic ally of the United States. To finance the trade deficit, Americans must either borrow or sell off real American assets. The trade deficit makes America the largest debtor, D-E-B-T-O-R, nation in the world. But there are other interesting economic aspects of the trade deficit. To keep its currency from appreciating, China has purchased copious amounts of American debt. The Chinese government buys U.S. government bonds. In essence, China has been financing American budget deficits because of the trade surplus they have incurred with the U.S. over the last 30 years. This is just scratching the surface of this important issue, but it demonstrates how and why economics is a study of everything. Energy. It wasn't that long ago that coal provided 50% of the power in the United States. That's now down below 20%. And it's not because of environmental concerns. It's because of directional drilling and fracking. The United States has discovered just goo gobs of natural gas. For every one person working to keep a natural gas furnace running to provide electricity, you need 3 people in a coal factory, in a coal furnace energy production facility. It's economics economics that forced the transition from coal to natural gas. No doubt America should explore renewable energy. However, there is always a cost. To secure the rare earth elements necessary to make wind work for and solar panels work, the United States needs to purchase those rare earth elements from China. 70% of the world's supply is in China, and China uses giant diesel-powered earth movers to mine these rare earth elements. So remember, there is always a cost. Clean energy or renewable energy is not as clean as readily advertised. Poverty and income distribution. 1/5 or 20% of the income earners in the United States take home 52% of the income. The bottom 60% of income earners take home collectively 30% of the income. We are not achieving equitable distribution of income. However, the only lever the government has to pull to address this issue is taxation. And taxing wealthy individuals at higher rates generally leads to slower economic growth. Plus, you often hear politicians use the term fair share when it comes to wealthy people, that the highest income earners need to pay their fair share. But this is offered in ambiguous terms. What do we mean by fair share? Yes, the highest 1/5 of income earners, and there's roughly 170 million Americans in the U.S. labor force, the highest 20% take home 52% of the income, but they also pay 87% of the tax burden. So it's another interesting economic debate. Taxes, corporate and individual. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Here's one serious positive statement. This is objective. It is inefficient to keep flip-flopping between corporate tax rates. Corporations like certainty when making long-term decisions as far as investment in machines, equipment, tools, factories, what we call capital infrastructure spending. The Biden administration raised corporate taxes after the Trump administration lowered corporate taxes. Trump intends to lower them again. This flip-flop is not leading to efficiency for our U.S. economy. The individual tax system in the United States is a marginal tax system. Personal income taxes will never go away. It's really a question of, at the margin, should we increase or decrease individuals' tax rates? The last one we won't spend too much time on, but moral issues. Abortion, stem cell, euthanasia. The big moral issue of the next 30 to 50 years will be the idea of gene manipulation. A company called CRISPR already has the ability to alter genes. So you want your child to have blue eyes, you want your child to be taller, you want your child to be more athletic. The economic issue is that wealthy people may be able to afford some of these services, while other people on the lower income spectrum can't pay for them. Plus, do we really think it's moral or ethical to use gene therapy to alter an individual's biochemical makeup? If economics is the study of everything, who are the economists whose ideas influence public policy? The father of economic thinking, Adam Smith, Scottish philosopher, published his groundbreaking work, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, outlining the principles of market capitalism and the efficiency of the invisible hand as the best approach to allocate limited or scarce resources, advocating for markets to determine the price of goods and services. David Ricardo, in 1817, published a book called On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Ricardo outlined the concept of comparative advantage, which is the economic rationale for specialization in trade. Nations should take their limited or scarce resources and concentrate in producing products in which they have what Ricardo coined a lower domestic opportunity cost, leading to the most efficient use of limited resources, in essence, making all nations better off through trade. Not everyone agreed with market capitalism and the idea of laissez-faire market economics, allowing the invisible hand to determine the allocation of scarce resources. In his work, Das Kapital, published in 1867, Karl Marx acts as the antagonist to Smith, suggesting society would be better served allowing the government to control limited or scarce resources. He was a huge proponent of what he called the proletariat. He criticized capitalism because of its concentration of wealth in the hands of the business owner. Market capitalism dominated economic thought for quite some time until the 1930s, when all economies in modern industrialized sense of the term suffered the Great Depression. This was an economic calamity not only in the United States, but across the world. In answer to the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes published a book known as The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Keynes was a proponent of market economics, but suggested when the economy suffers a severe economic downturn, it is the role of the government to step in to sustain what he referred to as full employment domestic output. In other words, sometimes the private sector needs a little assistance from the public sector to get the economy back on track. In 1989, Todd G. Buchholz published a book called New Ideas from Dead Economists. In essence, the book explains the principles and concepts outlined by these famous economists and teaches us that these dead economists still influence public policy today and are still relevant to all socioeconomic issues domestically and globally. Continuing the effort to build the economics perspective, vitally important to identify some economic methodology. Economics terminology. Economists often use terms human beings are familiar with, the average everyday person thinks they know and understand, but economists have a completely different connotation for a familiar term or word. For instance, rent. When the average everyday person hears the term rent, they think someone has signed a lease and is using a commercial building or is living in an apartment or a house paying the landlord. However, to an economist, the term rent is the income generated from the use of a land resource. So, for instance, extracting oil from a well, the business owner sells barrels of oil. The income associated with that economic event is referred to as rent or rental income. Just be aware, it's an unfamiliar usage of a otherwise familiar word. Another example, investment. When the average everyday person hears the term investment, they think purchasing a bond, a stock, God forbid a cryptocurrency. The economist uses the term investment to refer to a company, small, large, medium-sized business, purchasing machines, equipment, tools, or building a factory. This type of expenditure is known as investment spending. Be careful of economists using familiar terms with completely new connotations. Generalizations or tendencies of the norm. Remember, economics is a social science. Economics doesn't have the luxury of testing ideas in the laboratory like chemistry. If 9 out of 10 people act in a certain way, that is good enough to build the economic thinking and model. For instance, when the economy is in a recession, an economic contraction, a downturn, the federal government may institute fiscal stimulus by cutting taxes for working Americans. Anybody making $80,000 or less will get a tax cut. The government understands not every working American will spend the additional disposable income. Some Americans will actually pocket, aka save, their tax cut. But when trying to determine how the tax cut will influence the economy and theoretically improve the economic outlook if 90% of workers spend all of the tax cut. That's good enough to build the model. Tendencies of the norm. Other things equal, the ceteris paribus, that's Latin for other things equal, assumption. When attempting to make sense of one economic variable, economists employ the ceteris paribus, other things equal methodology. What does this mean? Assume economists are attempting to figure out how a reduction in interest rates by the Federal Reserve will affect the macroeconomic or overall business cycle outlook. Generally speaking, lower interest rates entice households to purchase cars because they borrow money on car loans for that large expenditure. Lower interest rates entice households to buy new homes or refinance existing homes. Lower interest rates also influence businesses. Small, medium-sized, and large corporations may find it more profitable to invest in new capital at lower interest rates, discovering opportunities where the expected rate of return on a new project is greater than the now lower interest rates. However, this assumes that nothing else is changing in the economy. For instance, if the economic outlook has declined precipitously and the U.S. is in the midst of a severe recession, lower interest rates may not stimulate spending the way predicted. But remember, we employ the other things equal ceteris paribus methodology to determine how a change in one variable will affect the economy. Understanding that this is sometimes unrealistic, but as a method to figure out how that change in the one variable would theoretically affect the economic outlook. Economists love graphs. Economists use graphical expressions to build models. Economic models are designed to reflect real-world events. The effectiveness and efficiency of models only works if they have some semblance in reality. However, economists understand that two-dimensional graphs aren't a perfect representation of real-world events. Economic models are a starting point and an effective way to analyze economic issues and events, but they are not perfect. Economics is divided into two subsets, microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics investigates the individual decision makers and components within the larger framework of the economy. Popular topics in microeconomics include an investigation of the four market models: pure competition, monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition, and the role of government in maintaining the competitive forces of demand and supply and efficiency, especially in an industry dominated by a few large firms. For instance, there are only 6 or 8 manufacturers of household appliances. Do these few players possess market power such that they can charge customers higher prices than what would occur in a purely competitive industry? And what role does the government play in maintaining competition? On the other hand, macroeconomics investigates the economy in totality as a whole, the aggregate economic behavior. Popular topics of macroeconomics include measuring total production of a nation, aka GDP, the unemployment rate, the measure of the aggregate price level, inflation, business cycles, federal budget deficits, the trade deficit. These are topics of macroeconomics. Please understand that microeconomics and macroeconomics are not mutually exclusive. For instance, the oil industry At first glance, the oil industry might seem like a microeconomic topic because it investigates only a single industry within the larger framework of the economy. However, oil prices have serious implications on the business cycle, as it is a necessary input or resource for production and transportation of goods, and therefore ultimately has an impact on the big picture as well. When building the economics perspective, it is vitally important to differentiate between positive economics and normative economics. Positive economics, factual statements about observable reality, economic phenomena which are true. Currently, it's June of 2025. The unemployment rate is 4.2%. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics has been measuring the unemployment rate the same way for decades. No one can argue with the statement that in June of 2025, the current U.S. unemployment rate is 4.2%. Normative economic statements are subjective. They are opinion-based statements about what ought to be. So for instance, if one were to state, this is the worst job market in 30 years, that is debatable. It's an opinion. My favorite economist was a professor I had at St. Joseph's University 3 times in my undergraduate studies, Dr. George Prendergast. His famous saying was, you can tell an economist, but you can't tell him much. There is much debate among economists regarding policies and outcome. Those are normative debates. 2 economists can be presented with the same data and have different opinions as to the proper policy or economic approach to addressing a certain issue. Obviously, moving forward, understand that economic arguments and debates are normative in nature. Every nation should attempt to achieve 8 economic goals: growth, full employment, efficiency, price level stability, economic freedom, equitable distribution of income, and balance of trade. Unfortunately, not all of these goals are compatible. There are often trade-offs between these economic goals. It is also an opportunity to introduce some important macroeconomic statistics as we evaluate the 8 economic goals. Economic growth: limited resources, unlimited economic needs and wants. An economy that is growing lessens the burden of scarcity and improves living standards. In 2024, U.S. GDP, or total economic production for the year, was slightly more than $29 trillion. Over the past 50 years, the U.S. economy has grown at an average annual rate of 2.5%. It is obvious to identify the importance of economic growth as an economic goal. Full employment: June 2025, the current unemployment rate 4.2%. Zero unemployment is not only impossible, it's actually not even desirable. There's always some level of unemployment. Over the past 60 years, the unemployment rate has averaged somewhere in the neighborhood of 4%. During an economic downturn, unemployment tends to skyrocket, making it difficult for average, everyday, hardworking Americans to sustain their standard of living. So therefore, providing a job to every person who's ready, willing, and able to work seems like a reasonable economic goal, and it is compatible with economic growth. Limited resources, unlimited economic needs and wants. Therefore, it makes sense to operate efficiently. Economic efficiency is a necessary goal for all economies. Price level stability. The most common statistic used to measure inflation is the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. The target for inflation annually is 2%. In 2021, the U.S. economy had inflation of 7%. When the prices of goods and services is increasing faster than real wages, it makes it difficult for the average American to sustain their standard of living. Therefore, price level stability is an important economic goal. Economic freedom. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, 1776, laissez-faire capitalism, hands-off, government step to the side and allow private sector to do its magic in terms of market capitalism. However, absolute economic freedom comes at a cost. There could be out-of-control pollution, worker safety in factories, unsafe products and services. Therefore, we need some level of government regulation to oversee the market economy. But it's a really good example of marginal thinking. Enough regulation to ensure the safety and stability of the economy without overregulating, which slows economic growth and therefore reduces improvements in standards of living. Equitable distribution of income. The top 1/5 or 20% of income earners take home 52% of the total economic pie in terms of income received by the 170 million hardworking Americans in the U.S. labor force. However, those same 1/5 of income earners pay 87% of the tax burden. The only mechanism to reduce inequitable distribution of income is higher taxes. Unfortunately, higher taxes tend to stifle or slow economic growth. Europe has higher tax rates than the United States, and between 1980 and 2000, the economic growth rate of European nations was roughly half of that of the United States. Again, goals are not always compatible. Sometimes they conflict. Economic security. Generally speaking, no one argues with the idea of providing a healthy and sustainable life for individuals who are incapable of taking care of themselves, specifically people who are severely disabled and or unable to work. Balance of trade. In 2024, the U.S. trade deficit was $918 billion. That is to say, the value of imports exceeded the value of exports by $918 billion. The U.S. must finance or pay for the trade deficit by borrowing or selling off real American assets. It is a great normative debate whether or not the trade deficit is a serious economic problem. It's also an issue because we tend not to have the greatest relationship with China, the country with whom we have the largest trade deficits. Remember, when identifying and explaining these goals, some of these goals are compatible, but some of the economic goals conflict. Economists are leery of the pitfalls to sound reasoning and identify 3 economic fallacies to be aware of. The first fallacy, the fallacy of composition. What is good for the individual is good for the group as a whole. This is not necessarily true and is oftentimes false. Consider a sporting event or a concert. One individual stands up to get a better vantage point to see the show or the sporting event better. When everyone stands up, the entire audience is made worse off. How about the blueberry industry? One blueberry farmer has what is referred to as a bumper crop. The growing season is absolutely perfect, and the yield, the crop output, is enormous, above and beyond expectations. This farmer brings his blueberries to market, expecting to cash in. However, the farmer quickly discovers that every farmer in the industry had a bumper crop yield. The oversupply of blueberries causes the price of blueberries to plummet, and all farmers are made worse off. What was good for the individual was bad for the group as a whole. The second fallacy, the post hoc fallacy. Event A precedes event B, therefore A caused B. This is not necessarily true. Politicians attempt to use the post hoc fallacy quite often directly after elections. Donald Trump gets elected in 2016, takes office in 2017. After the first quarter of being in office, just a mere 3 months, economic growth quickens, and the Trump administration attempts to argue that the faster economic growth relative to previous quarters was somehow the administration's doing. The macroeconomic output and results for the United States is like a glacier. It takes lots of momentum to move the meter, so to speak. The third fallacy, correlation versus causation. It is oftentimes argued by economists, politicians, other people in the social science arena that one event is somehow correlated to another occurrence when this is absolutely positively false. This type of logic or reasoning can lead to poor policy. For instance, first George Bush Sr., then his successor Clinton, and then Bush Jr. all argued that getting lower income and middle income individuals into housing would create economic benefits for these individuals. What was their thinking? They were all guilty of the correlation versus causation fallacy. The administrations evaluated the data of homeowners and came to the conclusion individuals who own homes achieved higher level of educational success, stayed in jobs longer, stayed married longer, and gathered wealth at a quicker rate. The correlation versus causation error was that somehow home ownership was the reason or cause of the economic success of these individuals. However, it turns out that most of the people who own homes are highly successful because they are probably motivated, intelligent, creative individuals. It had nothing to do with home ownership. And this correlation versus causation error, in essence, had a major contributing factor to the housing crisis that eventually caused a large part of the economic downturn known as the Great Recession. The burden of scarcity is an economic reality. Resources, land, capital, and labor are limited. Economic needs and wants are insatiable and infinite. Therefore, every country must decide which economic system is best to address the reality of scarcity. And the economic system must solve 4 coordination problems. First one, what should be produced? Second, how much of every type of production should take place? Third, how will the nation decide how to allocate resources to manufacture and produce output? And then finally, how do we distribute the output and the income associated with economic production? Now, moving forward, there is a 5th question to address, and that is how to accommodate change. There are, broadly speaking, 2 economic systems available for nations to address the burden of scarcity, to answer the 4 coordinating economic problems / issues. Adam Smith, 1776, Wealth of Nations, introduced the world to pure laissez-faire capitalism, aka the market system. Sometime later, Karl Marx, in his writing Das Kapital, 1867, explains his proposed system of central planning, the command system, socialism. In essence, the philosophical divide between these 2 economic systems is who owns the scarce or limited resources, who controls the land, capital, and labor. Under pure laissez-faire market capitalism, private ownership of economic resources, and the market addresses the questions of what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce it, and who receives the benefits of economic energies and production. Under the command system, central planning, government control of land, capital, and labor, the means of production are turned over to a central planning committee, and the committee decides how to address the four questions of what to produce, how much to produce, how to go about the production, and who receives the economic benefits of the economic efforts. The pros and cons of these two systems will be addressed on the next several slides. In his book, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith outlined the principles of free market laissez-faire capitalism. One of the key components of laissez-faire capitalism, private ownership of the means of production. The land, capital, and labor necessary to produce goods and services are owned by households. Citizens decide through markets what to produce, how much to produce, and who receives the economic benefits. It turns out that the rationing function of prices and the invisible hand is an amazing efficient mechanism to decide those four economic questions / coordinating issues. Under pure laissez-faire capitalism, limited government. The role of the government is to provide defense, to protect the state from foreign invasion, a healthy police force to prevent lawlessness, and an effective and efficient court system to enforce the rights of private property and contracts necessary to execute market transactions. What are the benefits of market capitalism, laissez-faire approach to organizing an economy, and the market mechanism? Efficiency, especially allocative efficiency. Scarce land, capital, and labor is allocated to the production of goods and services most desired by consumers / households. Consumer sovereignty. After going to work and receiving income, individuals vote with their dollars on which goods and services maximize their utility. Likewise, capitalism promotes innovation. Individuals are incentivized to seek out the next best alternative of production and introduce new goods and services. The competition of markets leads to the most efficient use of limited or scarce resources. Finally, it is not to be underscored the importance of incentives. Human beings are incentivized to maximize not only their own physical capital, but the limited land and machinery available within society. What are the pitfalls or downside of laissez-faire capitalism, especially in its purest form? First one is wealth disparity. One criticism of capitalism is that the owners of businesses tend to accumulate large amounts of wealth, and the wealth can be passed on to their heirs. Another and probably more pressing issue is the dangers of unfettered markets. Without government regulation, businesses do not have to worry about safety within their factories, and the manufactured goods that they introduce to society are likewise could be unhealthy or unsafe. Additionally, there are externalities such as pollution. So pure laissez-faire capitalism is not without its issues, although it is rather efficient. In his 1867 work Das Kapital, Karl Marx offers a refute of laissez-faire capitalism after observing the enormous disparity of income and the plight of the average worker produced by the Industrial Revolution. The antagonist Karl Marx offers an alternative economic system. Government control of economic resources, also known as central planning, to address the four questions of what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce it, and who receives the economic benefits of economic energies. Marx suggested turn over the land, capital, and labor means of production to a central planning committee to answer these questions, especially in regard to prices and production. The goal of socialism sounds utopian and almost religious in nature, that the proletariat will all share in the economic production and it will ultimately lead to the most equitable distribution of income. Each to his own, each to his ability, everyone shares equally in economic production. Unfortunately, in reality, socialism doesn't work out so well. Wherever it's been tried, it's failed. The initial Bolshevik attempt to achieve this socialist utopia was instituted by Lenin in Russia. After a century of failed attempts, the best way to explain why socialism fails is the Milton Friedman quote, "Where in the world are we going to find these angels who are going to organize society for us?" It turns out deciding what to produce, how much to produce, and for who receives the benefits are not easy questions to answer for a central planning committee. Socialism, or the command system, leads to lack of efficiency. It removes incentives for both individuals and institutions, and it stifles innovation. After introducing the two economic systems in theory, let's talk about economic reality. Neither pure laissez-faire capitalism nor the central planning ideology of Karl Marx exists in reality anywhere on planet Earth. Take the United States, for instance. Post-Great Depression and World War II, the U.S. has shifted away from pure laissez-faire capitalism and towards more of a central planned social welfare market system. Undoubtedly, the United States is still right-leaning or capitalist-leaning, as you can observe on this chart, similar to Japan. But transfer payments as a percentage of GDP, in other words, social welfare programs including Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Section 8 housing, those type of social welfare programs have risen from 6% of GDP in 1960 to roughly 15% of total economic output today. So the government is far more involved with the redistribution of income than it was, say, 100 years ago. Likewise, central planning in its purest form never existed. Black markets for the production and distribution of necessities existed in Soviet Russia. I recently saw an interview with a man who escaped from North Korea, and he talked about the black markets that existed within the framework of that authoritarian communist regime. So in reality, pure laissez-faire capitalism and absolute central planning do not exist on planet Earth. It's really a question of at the margin. You can see that European countries, France and Sweden, for instance, on this chart, are more left-leaning or more welfare states than United States and Japan. A really good study is China. China in 1978 would have been as far left as North Korea. Under Mao, China adopted communist central planning system with unfortunately grave results. Millions of people starved under the Great Leap Forward. In 1978, the leadership of China made a conscious decision to abandon its economic hibernation, and now China has a system of combined capitalism with socialist tendencies. The economic lesson here is, in reality, neither pure laissez-faire capitalism nor the command system works, and some semblance of both systems is necessary for economic success. It's really a question of, at the margin, what societies decide to do with their limited or scarce resources to address the four questions of what to produce, how to produce it, how much to produce, and who receives the economic benefit of economic production. Remembering that the fifth question of how to address change over time is also a necessary component of any economic thinking. Time to wrap it up with a quick recap of the economics perspective. Economics is all about doing the best with the least. Land, capital, and labor, the economic resources, are limited relative to human needs and wants. Scarcity forces us people on Earth to make choices, and every choice involves a cost. Therefore, human beings should act rationally. Individuals act to maximize their own self-interest, utility. Businesses act to maximize profit, and hopefully governments act to maximize the collective utility of the citizens within their great nations. The value of any choice or decision is measured by the next best alternative. Opportunity cost. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Every choice has a cost. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Many decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. The next unit of consumption or activity makes sense if and only if the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. Incentives matter. Human beings act according to the rules of the game, and when those rules are changed, we will expect human behavior to change according to altered incentives. Economic events do not happen or occur in a vacuum. When one event happens, it often has a trickle-down effect and occurs and many other things moving forward. Generalizations. To make sense of real people in the real world, economists don't have the luxury of operating in a laboratory. If 9 out of 10 people act in a certain way, that's good enough to make strong economic predictions about human behavior. Other things equal, ceteris paribus. When trying to examine or determine how a change in one variable will affect the overall economic prediction, economists employ this assumption, understanding in reality this is not realistic, but it's a starting point to determine how that variable affects economic circumstances. Micro versus macroeconomics. Microeconomics is an investigation into the individual decision makers and components within the larger framework, and macro is the big picture in the aggregate total economic production, unemployment, business cycle, inflation, and such. Positive versus normative economics. There is no argument among positive economic statements or about positive economic statements. These are factual observations. Normative economics are value-based opinion statements, and this leads to economic debate. The 8 economic goals. Not going to list all 8 here. Just understand that some of the economic goals are compatible, some of the economic goals conflict, and this is an important idea in economics itself, that there are often trade-offs. Just ask Thomas Sowell, author of 20-some books, super intelligent economist. The economic fallacies, the fallacy of composition, the POC fallacy, and the correlation versus causation fallacy. Be careful of these pitfalls to sound economic reasoning. Economists are proponents of voluntary trade. Ricardo, the idea of comparative advantage. Specialize in producing a good or service in which you enjoy a lower opportunity cost. Trade for the other service. Voluntary trade makes everyone better off. Economic models. Economists use graphs and build models. Those graphs and models are only valuable if they are relatively good at predicting economic behavior. Therefore, theory versus reality, understanding that two-dimensional models do have limitations. The economic systems. There are, broadly speaking, 2 systems, capitalism and socialism. The major divide, who owns or controls the economic resources. Capitalism advocates for private ownership of economic resources. Socialism, those economists are proponents of government control of the means of production or central planning. Both systems have to address the 4 economic questions of what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce it, and who receives the economic benefit of production. Last but not least, economics is an interesting social science because theory versus reality, prediction versus what you think is best. There are often normative debates. Economists can look at the same situation and come to vastly different conclusions. You can tell an economist, but you can't tell them much. there isn't always agreement about policy. Thank you for listening and observing. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation of the economics perspective.